There is a story that has been passed around the Ozark Hills for over 100 years. Old-timers tell it different ways. Some say it happened in Arkansas, some say Missouri, but almost every version starts the same way, with a hole in a hillside that was filled in with stone and dirt and silence, on purpose. This is one of those local legends. Nobody can prove all of it happened exactly this way. There are no official army records that confirm every detail, but the story has survived for generations because of what people say was found when the hole was finally opened again. So settle in, because whether you believe it or not, by the end of this, you will understand exactly why people in those hills still won't go looking for that cave after dark. It is the spring of 1881. The Ozark Mountains are still wild in a way that is hard to imagine now. No highways cut through these hills, no power lines, just ridge after ridge of oak and hickory, fog sitting low in the hollows in the morning, and creeks that run clear and cold over limestone beds that have been there since before there were people to name them. This is karst country. Underneath nearly every hill, water has been eating away at soft stone for thousands and thousands of years, hollowing out tunnels, chambers, and cracks that nobody has ever seen the bottom of. The Ozarks, as the story goes, are basically Swiss cheese. Caves everywhere, some no bigger than a closet, some big enough to swallow a barn hole and keep going. According to the legend, there was a particular hillside, somewhere in this stretch of wilderness, that the local Osage and Cherokee families who still lived in those parts had quietly avoided for longer than anyone could remember. Not because of bears, not because of snakes. The old families, so the story goes, called it a place where the ground breathes wrong. Settlers who came later heard the same warning, but mostly waved it off as superstition, the way settlers tended to do with most things they didn't understand yet. Then in the legend, something happened that made the United States Army show up. Nobody in the story agrees on exactly what it was. Some versions say a survey crew sent out to map the territory went into the cave and never came back, and when a second crew went in after them, they came out half a day later pale, shaking, and refusing to say a single word about what they saw. Other versions say a local hunter wandered in chasing a wounded deer and emerged 3 days later, not 3 hours, with no memory of where the time had gone, and rambling about stairs that went down into the dark, carved straight into the rock, smooth as if 1,000 feet had walked them 1,000 years. Whatever the spark was, the story says a small detachment of soldiers was sent out from a nearby fort to investigate, and what they found, supposedly, scared them enough that they didn't just leave a sign or post a guard. They sealed the entrance, permanently. According to the legend, the soldiers spent days hauling stone, packing earth, and according to some versions, drilling a small charge of black powder into the rock above the entrance to bring down a controlled collapse, burying the cave mouth under tons of rubble. The work was slow and miserable, the story says, because more than one of the men assigned to the detail refused to go anywhere near the entrance itself once the sun started going down. They worked through daylight hours only. Nobody, according to the tale, was willing to spend even a single night camped within sight of that hillside, and the officer in charge, whose name has been lost entirely to the retellings, supposedly moved the entire camp nearly a mile downstream each evening, just to put running water and distance between his men and whatever lay behind that opening in the rock. Local families who told the story afterward said the soldiers were under strict orders never to speak about what was inside. A few of the old-timers who passed the tale down claimed their grandfathers had heard it straight from a soldier years later, an old man by then, who only ever said one thing about it before he died: "We didn't seal it to keep people out. We sealed it to keep something in." There's a smaller detail that gets added in some versions of the story, one that doesn't always make it into every telling, but which has stuck with the families who do tell it. They say that before the soldiers brought the hillside down, 2 of the men went back inside one final time, against orders, just to look. And when they came back out, neither of them would say a word about what they'd seen. One of them, the story goes, refused to ever set foot in those hills again, requesting a transfer out of the territory entirely within the month. The other apparently never spoke of it at all, not even decades later, not even when pressed by his own children, except for that single sentence passed down through one family's oral history, the sentence that has outlived every other detail of the entire event. "We didn't seal it to keep people out. We sealed it to keep something in." That is the legend as it has come down through the hills for a century and a half. A story, a piece of Ozark folklore, sitting right alongside ghost lights and headless hounds and all the other tales that get told around a fire when the night gets long. Nobody can hand you a government document proving the army did this in 1881. What we do have, what people in the area still talk about, is what supposedly happened more than 40 years later, when a trapper, working that same stretch of hills, found his way back into that hillside, and what he claims he found waiting for him in the dark below. So let's tell it the way it's been told. Let's walk into those hills the way he did. The year in the legend is 1923. More than 4 decades have passed since the soldiers supposedly packed that hillside shut. The Ozarks have changed some by now. There are small towns scattered through the hills, dirt roads connecting them, a railroad line not too far off. But the deep hollows, the steep ridges where the timber is thick and the land drops away fast, those are still wild. Still the kind of place where a man can walk for a full day and not cross another living soul. The man at the center of this story is a trapper. The legend doesn't give him a confirmed full name that survives in every telling, but most versions call him by a single name, Eli, an older man, maybe in his 50s, who has run trap lines through this part of the Ozarks his whole life, same as his father did before him. He knows these hills the way you know the rooms of your own house in the dark. He knows which ridges hold mink, which hollows the foxes favor, where the creek runs deep enough to ice over slow in winter, and where it freezes fast. He has heard the old stories about the hillside his whole life. Every kid who grew up in those hollows heard them. The cave that the soldiers sealed, the breathing ground. Don't go up there, the old folks would say, and like every story told to scare children, it had mostly settled into the back of his mind as something between a memory and a myth, the kind of tale that loses its teeth as you get older and busier, and more concerned with real, immediate things, like making rent and putting food on the table. But that particular fall, the fur prices are good, and Eli is pushing his trap line further than he usually does, up into a stretch of hills he hasn't worked before. He is following a game trail along a ridge, checking for fox sign, when he notices something that stops him cold. The hillside ahead of him doesn't look right. It's subtle. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you'd walk right past it. But Eli has spent his whole life reading land, reading the way water moves, the way rock settles, the way a hillside is supposed to slope. And this hillside has a flat patch on it that doesn't belong. A section of stone and packed earth that looks less like a natural outcrop and more like something that was built, stacked, piled with intention, then grown over with 40 years of moss, root, and leaf litter, until nature did its best to swallow the evidence. He stands there a long moment, just looking at it. The wind moves through the hickory trees overhead, and somewhere off in the hollow, a creek is running low and quiet over stone. And then, slow and clear, the old story floats up out of the back of his memory. The breathing ground, the soldiers, the hillside they sealed and never spoke of again. He tells himself it's nothing, probably an old rock slide or a foundation from some long-abandoned homestead. People built things in these hills and then left them, more often than you'd think. But even as he tells himself that, his feet are already carrying him closer. Up close, the wall of stone is even stranger than it looked from a distance. It isn't a random jumble of rock the way a natural slide would be. There's a pattern to how it's stacked, big stones at the base, smaller ones wedged into the gaps above, the whole thing packed tight with what was once clearly hauled in earth, now thick with root systems that have had 4 decades to dig in and hold everything together like cement. Whoever built this wanted it to stay built. This was not a quick job. This took days, maybe longer, and more than one set of hands. Eli runs his palm along the cold stone. There's a gap, low near the base, where time and water and the slow, patient work of roots have done what soldiers in 1881 probably swore could never happen. A few stones have shifted. There's a black space behind them, no more than a foot wide, but it's there, a crack into the dark. And here is where the legend says something interesting happens. Eli doesn't go in, not that day. He sits back on his heels and just stares at that gap in the stone for a long, long while. The forest around him has gone quiet, the way it sometimes does in the late afternoon, like every bird and squirrel has decided all at once to hold its breath. He thinks about the old stories. He thinks about his traps, still set further down the ridge, waiting to be checked. He thinks about how a smart man, a man with any sense at all, would mark this spot in his memory, walk away, and never come back. But the legend says curiosity has always been a stronger pull on certain men than fear, and Eli was built from that same old stubborn cloth as every explorer who ever stuck his head into a dark place he had no business sticking it into. He marks the location in his mind, the bend of the creek below, the split oak at the top of the ridge, and he heads home as the light starts to fail, telling himself he'll think on it overnight. He does not sleep well that night. The story he heard as a boy keeps circling back through his mind, the soldiers, the sealed hillside, that one line that supposedly got passed down through the years. We didn't seal it to keep people out. We sealed it to keep something in. By the time the sun comes up, he has already decided. He packs a sack with a lantern, extra oil, matches wrapped tight in waxed cloth, a hand axe, a coil of rope, and his rifle, and he heads back up into the hills. It takes him most of the morning to widen the gap enough to fit through. The stone wall fights him every step of the way, like it genuinely does not want to let him in. He works the smaller rocks loose first, then levers the bigger ones with a stout branch, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the cool autumn air. A few times he has to stop and just breathe, hands braced on his knees, looking at that black gap getting steadily wider, and wondering if he's about to do something incredibly foolish. By early afternoon, the opening is wide enough. He lights the lantern, checks his rifle one more time, says what the legend describes as a short, quiet prayer, and steps through the wall the army supposedly built to keep this place shut forever. The first thing that hits him is the smell. Cold mineral, faintly sweet in a way that doesn't belong underground, like wet stone mixed with something almost floral. The second thing that hits him is the silence. Not regular cave silence, the kind where you can still hear water dripping somewhere off in the dark, or the faint hush of air moving through unseen passages. This is heavier than that. This is the kind of silence that presses on your eardrums, the kind you only notice because of how loud your own heartbeat suddenly sounds inside it. The lantern light throws a small, trembling circle in front of him, and beyond that circle there is nothing but black. The passage he has stepped into is taller than he expected, easily over his head, and wide enough that he doesn't have to duck or turn sideways. Limestone walls, pale and damp, curve up and away into shadow. Somewhere in the dark above him, he can hear the faint flutter and chitter of disturbed bats, and the sound nearly stops his heart before he tells himself it's nothing, just bats, that's all, perfectly natural. He moves forward slowly, lantern raised, boots crunching softly on a floor of loose gravel and old dust that looks like it hasn't been disturbed since long before he was born. The walls show the slow, patient sculpture of water-working stone over countless centuries, smooth ripples and folds in the limestone, the kind of formations that take longer to build than human history has even existed. For the first 20 or 30 feet, this is just a cave. An impressive one, sure, the kind that might make a man whistle low under his breath and wish he'd brought someone along to see it with him, but nothing more than that. And then the passage opens up. Eli stops walking. The lantern light isn't strong enough to reach the far walls anymore, and the ceiling has vanished somewhere up into a darkness his small flame can't touch. He has stepped into a chamber, and from the way his own breathing sounds, the way the air feels different against his skin, he can tell it's big, genuinely big. He picks up a loose stone from the floor and tosses it out into the dark ahead of him, and the sound of it landing comes back a full second later than he expects. The echo rolling and rolling before it finally dies out somewhere far off in the chamber. He stands there a long moment, lantern held high, turning in a slow circle, trying to get some sense of the size of the space around him. And that is when the light catches something at the far edge of his vision, low along the chamber floor, something that makes him go very, very still. It's not a natural formation. He walks toward it carefully, testing each step before committing his weight, lantern held out in front of him like a shield against the dark. And as he gets closer, the shape resolves itself into something his mind does not want to accept, even though his eyes are telling him plainly what it is. Stairs. Carved directly into the bedrock of the cave floor, descending down into a passage that drops away into darkness even deeper than the chamber he's standing in. Wide, evenly spaced steps, each one worn smooth in the center, the unmistakable polish that only comes from countless feet, over countless years, walking the exact same path again and again and again. Eli crouches down at the top of the staircase and runs his fingers over the stone. It's cold and damp under his hand, slick with the same thin film of moisture that coats everything in this cave, but underneath that he can feel the unmistakable evidence of tool marks, old ones, the kind of patient, careful chiseling that takes real time and real purpose. This was not some accident of geology. Somebody made this. Somebody stood right here, generations before he was born, maybe centuries before, and decided that this passage needed stairs, and then spent who knows how long carving them by hand into solid rock. He sits back on his heels and stares down into the dark below the staircase, and for a long moment he doesn't move at all. The legend says this is the exact point where every smart instinct in his body is screaming at him to turn around, climb back out through that gap in the stone wall, and never come back. And the legend also says that he doesn't listen to that instinct. Not yet. Because lying there, just a few feet down the first flight of stairs, half buried in a thin layer of dust and grit that has settled over it across who knows how many decades, is something pale, something that catches the lantern light in a way the surrounding stone doesn't. He climbs down 2 steps, then 3, and reaches out toward it, and his stomach drops the moment his fingers close around it, and he understands exactly what he's holding. It's a bone, human by the look and feel of it, what appears to be part of a forearm, weathered and old, but unmistakably human. And it's not the only one. As his lantern light sweeps further down the staircase, he can see more, scattered along the steps and the landing below, pale shapes half swallowed by dust, in numbers that make his throat go dry and his hand tighten hard around the handle of the rifle slung over his shoulder. For a moment, Eli does what any reasonable man would do. He stops cold, lantern shaking just slightly in his grip, and seriously considers turning around right there. He has trapped these hills for 30 years. He has seen plenty of bones in the wild deer, raccoon, the occasional unlucky hound that wandered too far from home. But there is something different about finding human bones scattered down a staircase that was carved into solid rock by hands that worked in patient silence, long before anyone in his family ever set foot in these hills. But the story he heard as a boy is louder now than it has ever been. We didn't seal it to keep people out. We sealed it to keep something in. And if that's true, if there really is something down here, then somewhere underneath the fear sitting heavy in his chest, a different feeling is starting to take hold. He needs to know. So he keeps going. The staircase descends in long, even flights, occasionally leveling out onto small landings before continuing down again, always curving gently to the left, like whoever carved this passage was deliberately following some natural fault line in the rock, rather than fighting against it. The walls here are different from the chamber above, smoother. In places, Eli's lantern catches what might be deliberate marks scratched into the stone, not quite pictures, not quite writing, just patterns, lines and curves that seem to repeat at intervals as he descends, like some kind of marker system whose meaning has been lost for longer than anyone alive could remember. The bones continue too, scattered here and there along the steps, never in large piles, but never entirely absent either. A rib here, a skull fragment there, turned half on its side, hollow eye socket catching the lantern light in a way that makes Eli's breath go tight in his chest every single time. He starts counting without meaning to, and somewhere around the 8th or 9th set of remains, he forces himself to stop, because the number climbing in his head is not a number he wants to be thinking about right now, alone, this deep underground, with nothing but a lantern and a rifle and a creeping cold settling into his bones that has nothing to do with the temperature of the cave. He loses track of how many steps he's descended. The staircase seems to go on much longer than any natural cave system has any business going, far deeper into the earth than the hillside above should logically allow. Twice he stops and presses his palm flat against the cold stone wall, just to steady himself, just to remind his racing mind that the world is still solid and real around him, even as everything about this place seems determined to convince him otherwise. At one point, he tries to count the steps just to give his mind something solid to hold onto, something ordinary and countable in a place that feels like it is actively trying to slip out from under any ordinary measurement. He gets to around 200 before he loses the thread entirely, his concentration broken by another scattering of bones across a landing, smaller these days, almost delicate, and he finds himself wondering, with a chill that has nothing to do with the cave air, whether some of them might have belonged to children. He doesn't stop to look closely enough to find out. He tells himself that's a mercy, not a cowardice, and keeps moving. The carved markings along the walls grow more frequent as he descends, and more elaborate too. Where the symbols near the top of the staircase were simple, just lines and curves repeating in steady intervals, the ones further down seem to build on each other, layering and overlapping in patterns that almost suggest a kind of grammar, a kind of message, though Eli has no framework at all for reading it. At one landing, he holds the lantern close to a particularly dense cluster of carvings and notices, with a creeping unease he can't quite name, that the deepest grooves in the stone are worn smooth, the same way the steps are worn smooth, the same way a doorknob gets polished by 1,000 hands over 1,000 years. Somebody touched these markings, often, for a very long time. The staircase curves again, steeper now, the steps narrower and closer together, forcing him to slow his pace and watch his footing more carefully. The lantern oil is burning lower than he'd like, and for the first time since stepping through the gap in the hillside, a small, practical fear works its way into his chest alongside the larger, vaguer one. What happens if the light goes out down here? He pushes the thought away and keeps descending, because turning back now feels, in some strange and irrational way, more dangerous than continuing forward, like he has crossed some invisible threshold of commitment that can't be undone simply by reversing his steps. The air changes as he descends. It grows warmer, not colder, which strikes him as deeply wrong because every cave he has ever been in gets colder the deeper you go, settling into that same steady 50-something degrees no matter the season. But here the air is growing warm, almost humid, carrying that same faint sweetness he noticed at the entrance, stronger now, mixing with something else underneath it that he can't quite place. Something mineral. Something almost like the smell right before a lightning storm, when the air itself seems to crackle with static. And then finally, the staircase ends. He steps off the last stair onto a floor of smooth, flat stone, and lifts his lantern high, and the small circle of light it throws catches the edge of something so large, so impossibly large, that for a long moment his mind simply refuses to process what his eyes are showing him. He is standing at the edge of a chamber that makes the one above seem like a closet by comparison. The lantern light cannot reach the walls, it cannot reach the ceiling, It barely manages to illuminate the floor stretching out in front of him, and even that floor is not the smooth, natural stone he expected. It is worked, carved. In places, he can make out what looks unmistakably like the remains of structures, low walls, the suggestion of doorways, all of it half collapsed and half swallowed by centuries of mineral deposits, dripping down from a ceiling so high above him that his lantern light dies somewhere in the dark long before it ever reaches it. Eli stands frozen at the bottom of the stairs, lantern trembling slightly in his outstretched hand, and for the first time since he stepped through that gap in the sealed hillside, he understands with absolute bone-deep certainty that whatever this place is, it was never meant to be found. For a long moment, he simply stands there at the bottom of the stairs, letting the silence of the place settle over him like a second skin. There is no wind down here, of course there isn't, there can't be, and yet every so often he swears he feels the faintest stir of air against his cheek, cool and then warm, almost like the chamber itself is exhaling. He tells himself it's just convection, just the natural movement of air through a connected system of tunnels and passages, the kind of thing any experienced caver could explain away in a sentence or two. But Eli is not an experienced caver. He is a trapper who has wandered, by accident and by stubbornness, somewhere he was never supposed to be, and right now, standing at the edge of that enormous black chamber, every explanation his mind reaches for feels thinner than the last. He should leave. Every fiber of sense left in him is saying the exact same thing, over and over, in a voice that sounds a lot like his late father's. Turn around, Eli. Walk back up those stairs, climb out through that gap, and never speak a word of this to another living soul. But the legend says curiosity, once it has its hooks fully set, does not let go easily, and so instead of turning around, he takes a slow step forward into the great chamber, lantern held high, rifle gripped tight in his other hand. Ruined structures he glimpsed from the staircase become clearer as he approaches them. Low walls of fitted stone, no taller than his waist in most places, arranged in patterns that almost suggest the layout of rooms, of a settlement, except built down here in the absolute dark, at the bottom of a staircase that descended further into the earth than should have been geologically possible. Whoever built this, and however long ago they did it, they did not simply stumble into a cave and decide to live there. This was planned, constructed, maintained for what must have been generations, based on the sheer scale of it. In the center of the chamber, the lantern light catches something that makes Eli stop walking entirely. A single structure, larger than the rest, circular, built up from the chamber floor in rings of fitted stone that spiral inward and upward like the inside of a shell. It stands taller than he is, easily, and as he draws closer, heart hammering hard enough now that he can feel it in his throat, he sees that the surface of it is covered, every visible inch of it, in those same scratched markings he noticed on the staircase walls. Lines, curves, repeating patterns that mean absolutely nothing to him, and yet somehow manage to feel deeply, unsettlingly deliberate, the way a locked door feels deliberate even if you don't know what's behind it. He circles the structure slowly, lantern raised, and on the far side he finds an opening. Low, narrow, just wide enough for a man to duck through if he were willing to get down on his hands and knees. And from somewhere beyond that opening, faint but unmistakable, he can hear something. It sounds like breathing. Slow, deep, rhythmic in a way that is far too steady, far too patient to be the wind or some trick of air moving through hollow stone, though Eli spends a long, desperate moment trying to convince himself that's exactly what it is. He stands frozen at that low opening, lantern shaking visibly now in his outstretched hand, and listens to that slow, steady sound rolling out of the darkness, in and out and in and out, and somewhere underneath the rational part of his mind that wants to call it wind or water or settling stone, a much older, much more animal part of his brain is screaming at him that he needs to leave, right now, immediately, and never look back. This time, finally, he listens to it. He doesn't remember much of the climb back up. The legend describes it as a blur of stairs and lantern light and his own ragged breathing, taking the steps 2 and 3 at a time, not caring anymore about the bones scattered across them, not caring about anything except putting as much distance as possible between himself and that low opening and that slow, patient breathing sound rolling out of it. He remembers bursting back through the chamber above, remembers scrambling through the gap in the sealed stone wall and out into daylight so bright and so sudden it feels like being born again, remembers collapsing onto the forest floor outside, gasping, shaking, the lantern still somehow clutched in his white-knuckled fist, even though the flame had gone out somewhere along the way. According to the story, he sat there at the base of that hillside for a long, long time, just breathing, just letting the ordinary sounds of the forest, birds, wind, the distant trickle of the creek, slowly convince him that the world above ground was still real, still solid, still safe. And then he did something the legend says took every ounce of strength he had left in him. He started piling stone back into that gap. Working through the rest of the afternoon and well into the evening, hauling rock and packing earth back into the opening he had spent the entire morning fighting to create, sealing the hillside shut again with his own 2 hands, the same way those soldiers supposedly had, 42 years earlier. He never went back. According to the legend, he never told a soul exactly what he saw down in that final chamber, though over the years, in the company of a drink or two, he was known to repeat one single sentence about it, the same sentence, almost word for word, every single time he was asked. He said the stairs weren't the strangest part. He said the strangest part was that something down there had been waiting so long, so patiently, that it had learned the sound of its own breathing, and had simply never stopped. The hillside, so the story goes, still sits out there somewhere in those Ozark hollows today, the gap Eli resealed long since grown back over with moss and root, and 40 more years of forest reclaiming what was briefly disturbed. Hunters who have passed through that stretch of hills over the decades since have reported the same strange feeling Eli described, a sense of being watched, a heaviness in the air, an instinct, sharp and immediate, that some places are simply not meant to be walked through. The story didn't stay contained to just Eli's own family, either, at least according to the way it's been passed down. A few decades later, in the middle of the 20th century, a small group of amateur cavers, the kind of weekend hobbyists who liked exploring the wild unmapped caves scattered all through the Ozark Plateau, are said to have heard a version of the tale from a local farmer and gone looking for the hillside themselves. The legend says they found something, a flattened, overgrown patch of hillside that matched the old description closely enough to get their pulses up, but that by the time they'd cleared enough brush and stone to confirm there was an opening behind it, the light was failing, and they made the decision to come back the following weekend, properly equipped, with better lanterns and a full day ahead of them. According to the story, when they returned the following weekend, they couldn't find the spot again. Not exactly. They searched for the better part of 2 days, working their way up and down that same stretch of ridge, comparing notes, double-checking landmarks, and never once managed to relocate the exact hillside they'd uncovered the week before. Eventually, they gave up and went home, and as far as anyone knows, that was the end of it. Some people who tell this part of the story take it as proof that the whole thing is nothing more than an elaborate piece of local folklore, 2 different groups simply misremembering an ordinary, unremarkable hillside. Other people who tell it take it the opposite way entirely, and say it proves something else altogether, that whatever is down there does not particularly want to be found twice. Whether any of it is true, whether a trapper named Eli ever really found a hidden staircase carved into Ozark bedrock, whether soldiers really sealed a hillside in 1881 to keep something contained that should never have been disturbed in the first place, that is a question nobody alive today can answer with any real certainty. There are no official records, no photographs, no bones in any museum collection tied to this story. Just a tale passed down through generations of Ozark families, told around fires and front porches, growing a little in the telling each time it's passed from one storyteller to the next, the way every good legend does. What we do know is that the Ozarks really are riddled with caves, more of them than anyone has ever fully counted or mapped, and that more than a few of those caves really have been found sealed shut by human hands, for reasons that range from the perfectly mundane, protecting livestock, keeping curious children safe, discouraging looters, to reasons that were never written down at all and have long since been lost to time. Somewhere in that overlap between ordinary, practical history and the stories people tell to make sense of the unexplained, legends like this one tend to take root and grow. But the next time you find yourself hiking through those old Ozark hollows, deep in a stretch of forest where the ridges rise steep and the hickory grows thick and the light struggles to reach all the way down to the forest floor, and you come across a hillside that looks just a little too flat, a little too deliberate, you might want to remember this story before you go digging around to find out why. Because if the legend is true, some doors get sealed for a reason, and some things that wait in the dark have learned a very dangerous kind of patience.